Mernaz, could you tell us how this project began? I mean, you've obviously worked on this for a few years. So what was the first seed of this idea?
Yes, I had a very strong feeling about the house. I have never been haunted by a house. I'm of course very, interested in certain spaces and architecture and all that of different buildings, and have felt different feelings about the houses, especially old houses before. But this house had a particular feeling, and I couldn't get it out of my head. So I decided to just put it in front of camera, put it in the picture to see what it is. So I asked Jonathan to get permission for me to film inside the house, and he also helped me. So that. But once I filmed it, of course I couldn't even then I couldn't understand why I did it. But I showed it to some friends, and they said, "Well, how come you ended up in Alabama?" I said, "Well, because of my friend." And then I realized that I have to put their experience and how they sort of. So I, excuse me. So the film started as really a standard documentary, talking about how the house was built, the history of the house, and all that. And then I had my own dialogue with the house, and my problem was really how to marry these two together, because one part was just my relationship with the house, and the other part is a documentary about the house. And
Well,
yeah.
if I can add something, I think one thing that Murnaz and I share in our work is, I guess you could say, three concerns that interface one another, which are art, criticism, and autobiography. And in a way, it's an unstable kind of combination, because when they overlap, it can get very confusing in some ways. But I mean, I think that's very much the preoccupation of the book that I quote from in the film, Moving Places. That even during the film criticism that I write, I tend to use autobiography quite a lot. And I think that it becomes very complicated because, on the one hand, if you're dealing with your own life and you're also trying to create art as well as comment on art, it's about all of these things, I think, in combination. And to what extent they can inform each other. That's part of what I think the challenge of that kind of work is also.
Mernal and Jonathan, congratulations for this cooperation and making this movie. I have a question for Jonathan about your childhood. Whenever we see you, most of the time you have a gun, and yet you are the one spending hours to convince your brother not to buy it.
Yes.
So I want to know what's happened in that process. And then for Mernaz, because there's a lot of similarity between you, your film, and your subject matter, Jonathan. Both of you, in a way, you say every house remind me a unhappy woman, his mom and your mom. But there is a lot of similarity in your workplace and your basically love for cinema. You didn't basically focus on those more than what we see.
Well, I think in terms of, I mean, I don't know what to say. I mean, when I was a young kid, I played with, like guns just like every other kid does. I mean, and it was just sort of like unfortunately, that's the vocabulary that we as Americans have to work with. And I think it's only when one gets older when one can start mistrusting that vocabulary. I think actually, this film I see is connected to Murnaz's previous film, Jerry and Me, which of course is about cinema. And it is also about autobiography and art and criticism. That's why, in a way, I think not the films she made before, but I think at least those two films have those things in common.
Well, there was a big part of the film that I wanted to. Well, actually, I tried, but I took it out, which was the relationship between cinema and modern architecture in Tehran as I was growing up in 1970s, and to this day, that when you go back to Iran, you don't recognize it anymore, because it's all all the modernization of the modernization of all these building around me. And when you go back, you want to look for your past, but the past is gone. The old neighborhood is all gone. It's part of it, either by war or by development. So, and also there are a lot of another part was the architecture, both in Iranian films as well as American films, that the image I had from America and the kind of houses they would have was from the American film that I had seen. I said, oh, that's the kind of house they live in. And as opposed to the traditional houses and some modern houses that I saw in the Iranian film. So, yes, please.
Beautiful film, Mernaz and Jonathan. Very sad on the one hand, but also very personal, as your other films. I think all of your films, Jonathan is right, all your previous films weave in autobiography and filmmaking and personal stories quite well. Jonathan brought up an interesting point by talking about how the architecture of his house may have impacted his cinematic vision and his analysis of films and so forth. I was wondering what the impact of your house was on your cinematic vision, Mernaz. That scene that you walk around the house crying is really very powerful, but beyond that, I'd like you to say something about the architecture of the house, the impact that it had on your film vision, the visual style of your film.
That's a very interesting question. I have to think about it. Because most of I have no images, no home movies from my houses in Iran. It's just memory and a feeling, and sometimes dreams that I have. A lot of dreams I've had, in those houses. But I'm not very conscious in terms of how they have influenced my filmmaking. But that's a very good question. I will think about it.
Yeah, no, is that on? Can you hear me?
Yes.
I just wanted to say that I'm 72 now, and I've seen a lot of films and read a lot of books about family and mothers and fathers, and assessing, what they meant to you or what they meant to themselves or who they really were. And I just realized that at my age still, I'm reassessing who they were and how they were. And what I see is actually, what I feel about them is actually changing. So for me, the architecture was not a main point, but the incredible personal stories of the people who came up in this, who were raised in this house, and all of the really intense interpersonal personal reactions. It was a wonderful thing for me to hear about family.
Yes, I was thinking another question that I never answered to myself was the idea of your house turning into a museum. I thought, well, if only our house in Iran was turned into a museum, what a museum would have been.
I'm not sure what I want to say, but I definitely want to say thank you. I just really related to it, and I grew up in River Forest, and our house, we lived there for 20 years, and it was almost like a sixth sibling we had that whole time that took up all the attention, and it was an old 100-year-old home that was always falling apart, and it was always the excuse for always our family's dysfunction, and we lost a lot of money in the housing crisis, and it was always keep your car clean because it's going to be your house one day, and it was the trauma of our lives, this house, and we loved the house because it was where we grew up, but we hated the house, and it was get it on the market, no, we can make it work, no, get it on the market, and you loved it and you hated it, and the part when you showed your house the last day, I'm guessing, of it, I remember that so clearly with all the stage furniture we had, and we had to say goodbye, and it wasn't this house anymore, but it was such a great, it was something that needed to happen. It was almost like a sibling you needed to, kill or say goodbye to. So, and these places encapsulate that chapter in your life, and you miss it, and you wish that house was a home, and it was your home, but it was never the home it was supposed to be. So I don't know what my question is. I was also curious about how you, because I like to share my story like that, and it's really on my mind that I try to share. I went to a 12-step program for families, and I asked my dad to drop me off, and he still didn't get it. So I just want to say thank you, but also if you want to comment on any of that, but my big question, I guess, would be how was it filming? Your parents, seems like I don't know anything about you, but you're a filmmaker, you seem to have a sense of what your family's impact was on you, and you tried to film them, and they didn't seem receptive to it necessarily, or the impact that you were trying to express in your art. How was it being that artist in the family and trying to express that and trying to get them to get that so directly and seeming to be still unresponsive to what you're trying to do?
Yes. Well, they say that when a writer is born to a family, that's the end of that family. And I think it's the same thing with they, of course, they would not really like it, but they were not. My father, at least, thought I'm just, he came here as a, for vacation or whatever to visit us. So he wasn't, he thought I'm just taking a picture. In fact, I did not intend to use it in any of my film, just a record of, his visit. But I had to, I think I hope that this is the last of my personal film. I really am sick of my life. So, but it was very therapeutic making personal films because I sort of got so much free from all the their grips, both in terms of my parents and in fact Jonathan said something to me. He said that in fact with this film you said goodbye to your parents, and I said I wish that this is the end. But yeah. And then you said something else that I was going to, respond to, which is the idea of having a house. A lot of immigrants that I have talked to, and for my other project, there is a dream that when they come, for example, to this country, at any price they have a house. Owning a house, it seems that it is very important. And I have had a lot of, of course, because of my problem with the housing, I've come to this point that, how much, I have moved from Iran to other places here, and, in doing that, I have lost so many places, lived so many places, and so the idea of a house, of course, was never, a very, a central point for me. It's just a place for memory more than anything else.